The world doesn't move randomly. When dozens of countries from Europe to the United States to the Middle East start cutting deals with one nation at the same time, it's not coincidence. It's a signal. Right now, that signal is pointing to India. Trade agreements, defense partnerships, energy negotiations, infrastructure corridors. One after another, countries are lining up to work with New Delhi, not out of goodwill, not out of curiosity, out of necessity, because something fundamental is shifting in the global order. Old powers are becoming uncertain, rising powers are becoming aggressive, and in the middle of that tension, the world is searching for a partner that is stable, independent, and increasingly indispensable. That partner is India. So the question isn't why India is rising. The real question is, why is everyone suddenly trying to make deals with India right now? And what does that tell us about where the world is headed next? If you enjoy deep, no-noise breakdowns like this, consider subscribing. It helps us keep making content that actually explains what's going on beneath the headlines. India has always been careful deliberately, sometimes frustratingly so. While others moved fast, India moved with intention. It weighed every decision, responded on its own terms, and played the long game. The world often mistook that for weakness. It wasn't. And now that long game is paying off. India isn't becoming important, it always was. What's changed is that the world is finally recognizing it. And there's a difference between being powerful and being seen as powerful. India has long been the former. It is now becoming the latter. So what changed? The answer is uncomfortable. The United States, once the anchor of the global order, is now seen by many as unpredictable, even unreliable. And as partners look for alternatives, their attention turns to New Delhi. And then there's China. Its rapid rise turned into visible coercion, economic pressure, territorial aggression, strategic overreach. The world began looking for something different, not another dominant power. India. Most commentary gets this only half right. Yes, China is pushing the world toward India, but India was already rising. China didn't create this moment, it accelerated it. Because this rise is structural, built on India's scale, growth, democracy, military strength, and geography. China is the accelerant. India was already the fire. This is clear in places like Greece. The port of Piraeus, a key European gateway, is majority controlled by China. That's not just economic, it's strategic, and it directly impacts India's vision for the India-Middle East-Europe corridor. So India's growing ties with Greece aren't symbolic, they're about building trust and reducing dependence on China. For India, it means a stronger European foothold. For Greece, greater relevance in a shifting world. There's another layer, Turkey. Greece and India share tensions with Ankara, creating natural alignment. And that's turning into real cooperation. India, once a major arms importer, is now exporting defense equipment to a NATO country. That's not incremental, that's transformation. And when India is called an upcoming superpower, it no longer sounds like flattery, it sounds like fact. In January of this year, India and the European Union signed what was widely described as the most significant trade agreement of the era, the mother of all deals. Access for India to all 27 EU member states under preferential terms. 27 countries, from the economic giants of Germany and France to the smaller but strategically important nations of Eastern Europe. One agreement, one India. The size and scope of what that represents cannot be overstated. The European Union is the largest single market on Earth by many measures. Getting preferential access to that market is something countries spend decades trying to achieve. India got it. And then, almost immediately afterward, came Washington. The United States announced an interim trade agreement with India, a deal that was remarkable not just for what it contained, but for the speed with which it happened and for what it revealed about the new global balance of power. Here is Donald Trump's version of events. He called Prime Minister Modi one of his greatest friends. He announced that the punishing reciprocal tariff on Indian goods, which had been sitting at 25%, would be reduced to 18%. He said India agreed to bring its own tariffs and non-tariff barriers on American goods down to zero. He said India would stop buying Russian oil and instead purchase much more from the United States, potentially including supplies from Venezuela. Big, dramatic claims. The kind of language that Trump has always favored. Sweeping, maximalist, definitive. And then something interesting happened. The official joint fact sheet was quietly but significantly revised. Where the original document said India would commit to buying more American products, the revised version said India intends to buy more. That one word change, from commits to intends, is not a typo. In the carefully constructed language of international diplomacy, it is everything. Intent is not obligation. Intent does not bind. Intent keeps the door open while making no promises about what walks through it. And there was more. Certain pulses, key agricultural products that form a staple of the Indian diet, products that directly touch the lives of tens of millions of Indian farmers, were quietly removed from the list of items where India would reduce or eliminate tariffs. That removal was a victory, a quiet, understated, technically worded victory, but a victory nonetheless. The digital sales tax, which India applies to the revenues of American tech giants operating on Indian soil, companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon, was also protected. Where the original language suggested India would remove this tax, the revised language said India committed only to negotiate around digital trade rules. Again, intent, not obligation. Sovereignty, not surrender. Now there are critics inside India who say the farmers were not protected enough, that the deal was signed too hastily, that India gave away too much in exchange for a tariff reduction that went from 25% to 18%. Still a significant tariff, not zero. Those critics deserve to be heard. Criticism is healthy. Skepticism is necessary. But here's the bigger picture that the critics sometimes miss. India sat across the table from the most powerful economy in the world, run by a president who has shown he is willing to use tariffs as weapons and trade deals as tools of domination. And India walked away with sovereignty intact. India said no to things it did not want to say yes to. India protected its farmers on the most sensitive items. India kept its right to tax foreign tech companies operating on its soil. India changed the language of binding commitments into non-binding intent. And the United States, agreed to those changes. That is not weakness. That is negotiating from strength. That is the kind of diplomacy that smaller, less confident nations simply cannot pull off. India pulled it off because India is no longer negotiating from a position of desperation. India is negotiating from a position of value. The value of its market, its population, its strategic location, its military capacity, and the simple fact that in a world where both America and China are becoming less reliable, India is becoming more essential. There is one part of this US-India deal that deserves closer, more uncomfortable scrutiny. Trump claimed publicly and dramatically that India had agreed to stop purchasing Russian oil. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov pushed back almost immediately, noting that no such statement had come from India itself. And he had a point. Because if you think about it carefully, really carefully, the idea that India would simply stop buying Russian oil because Donald Trump announced it on a social media post does not quite add up. India imports enormous quantities of Russian crude oil. It is not doing so out of sentiment or ideology. It is doing so because Russian oil, sold at a discount amid Western sanctions, is cheap. It powers Indian industry. It fuels Indian growth. It benefits Indian consumers. And according to some accounts, India has also been refining Russian crude and reselling petroleum products to other countries, turning the price differential into a revenue stream. None of that disappears because of a tweet or a Truth Social post. And then there is the geography problem. Trump suggested India could replace Russian oil with American or Venezuelan supplies. But Venezuela is on the other side of the planet. The shipping costs alone make Venezuelan oil structurally more expensive for India than Russian oil. The economics simply do not work the same way. So what is actually happening here? The most reasonable interpretation is this. India has not made any hard commitment about Russian oil. India may be willing to increase purchases of American energy products. That is genuinely in India's interest as a hedge against overdependence on any single supplier. But a total abandonment of Russian energy? That is not what India actually agreed to, regardless of how Trump described it. And yet, And this is where it gets genuinely complicated. There is a strategic dimension to the Russia question that goes beyond economics. Russia is fighting a war in Ukraine. The West wants that war to end. America under Trump has been trying to broker some kind of deal. If India can play any role in nudging Russia toward negotiations, even a small role, even an indirect role, that gives India diplomatic leverage of a kind that is extraordinarily valuable. India has a relationship with Russia that is old, deep, and complicated. India buys Russian oil. India operates Russian-made military equipment. India has historically maintained careful neutrality on the Ukraine conflict, abstaining on United Nations votes rather than condemning Russia outright. That position is sometimes criticized in the West. But from India's perspective, it is not hypocrisy. It is the same strategic autonomy, the same refusal to be told which side to stand on, that has defined Indian foreign policy since independence. And in this moment, that autonomy has value. Because India is one of the few countries in the world that both Russia and the United States will actually listen to. Not long ago, the relationship between India and Canada was in serious trouble. Under former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the two countries had descended into one of the ugliest diplomatic ruptures in recent memory. Allegations, expulsions, accusations that struck at the core of sovereignty and national dignity. It was a dark period, and it felt for a time like the damage might be lasting. But now there is Mark Carney. Carney, a former governor of the Bank of England, a man with deep experience in the mechanisms of global finance, came to power in Canada with a different energy, a different vocabulary, a different reading of the world. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Carney gave a speech that reverberated around the world. He spoke about middle powers, countries that are significant but not superpowers, nations with values and interests and influence that do not want to be dominated by either Washington or Beijing. He spoke about solidarity among those middle powers, about building relationships based on mutual respect rather than dependence on great power patrons who have become unpredictable. The world responded to that speech with something close to relief. And India? India listened, recognized the language, and smiled. Because India has been saying exactly this for years. Under Prime Minister Modi and Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar, India has built its entire foreign policy around precisely the concepts that Carney articulated in Davos: multipolarity, strategic autonomy, coalition building around specific issues rather than rigid alliances, the insistence that no single power has the right to dictate terms to the rest of the world. India did not need to validate Carney's speech officially. The alignment was obvious. When a new Canadian Prime Minister stands up at the world's most prestigious economic forum and describes the foreign policy philosophy that India has been practicing for a decade, that is not coincidence. That is convergence. And convergence in diplomacy is the beginning of something real. There is a visit to India being planned. There are conversations underway. The frozen relationship is thawing, not because India surrendered anything, not because India apologized for anything, but because the world has moved to a place where India's position, the position it always held, is now the position that other serious countries are adopting. There is a quiet satisfaction in that, not triumphalism, not gloating, just the quiet, dignified satisfaction of a country that held its ground and waited for the world to catch up. But here is the important caveat that India's own observers are careful to make. Speeches are not actions. Meetings are not relationships. Deals signed are not deals implemented. The world is full of beautiful words about India right now. Key partner, upcoming superpower, essential nation, gateway to the future. And many of those words are genuine, but some of them are also strategic flattery from countries that are hedging their bets, that are looking for leverage in their own negotiations with China or America, that see India as useful rather than as a true equal. India understands this. India has always understood this. The path to genuine superpower status is not paved with compliments. It is paved with consistent, sustained, credible action. Economic development that reaches the hundreds of millions who still live in poverty. Defense capability that can genuinely deter aggression from two nuclear-armed neighbors. institutional strength that gives the world confidence in India's stability and reliability as a long-term partner. Those things are being built, slowly, imperfectly, with all the friction and noise of a democracy of 1.4 billion people. But they are being built. There is a story within the story of India's rise that deserves its own moment. For most of independent India's history, the country's military depended heavily on imported equipment, first from the Soviet Union and Russia, aircraft, submarines, tanks, artillery, then increasingly from Western suppliers, France, Israel, the United States. That dependence had costs, not just financial costs, though those were enormous, strategic costs. When you depend on another country for the weapons that defend your territory and your people, you are not fully sovereign. You cannot make foreign policy decisions that might offend your arms supplier without weighing the consequences for your own defense. India felt those constraints for decades, and so India began to change. Slowly at first, then with accelerating momentum, India invested in indigenous defense production, missiles developed entirely within Indian laboratories, rockets designed and manufactured by Indian engineers, armored vehicles built in Indian factories under Indian brands. A domestic defense industrial ecosystem that did not exist at any serious scale 20 years ago and now stands among the most significant in the developing world. The Pinaka rocket system, the BrahMos supersonic cruise missile, a joint venture with Russia that India has developed into a world-class weapon system now being sold across Southeast Asia. Tata armored vehicles, mounted gun systems, a growing list of military products that other countries actually want. And now Greece, a NATO member state, is buying Indian weapons. If you had said those words 10 years ago in any serious defense policy forum, you would have been met with polite skepticism. India's defense industry was respected but not yet competitive at the international level. The products existed, but the quality, reliability, and after-sales support infrastructure needed to compete with American, French, or Israeli systems was still developing. That has changed. Greece is buying Indian Pinaka rockets. Greece is operating Tata armored vehicles and mounted guns. India reportedly offered Greece a cruise missile. These are not charity purchases. These are procurement decisions made by a NATO military that has evaluated the equipment and found it meets the standard. The implications for India are profound. Europe, sophisticated, demanding, standards-driven Europe, is a market that Indian defense exporters could barely dream of penetrating a decade ago. Greece may be the first, but the experts who watch this space closely believe it will not be the last. Eastern and Central European countries, whose Soviet-era equipment is aging and whose defense budgets are growing rapidly in response to the war in Ukraine, may find Indian systems increasingly attractive as alternatives. And then there is the issue of engine technology. India's next great defense ambition is an advanced indigenous fighter aircraft. But the engine, the heart of any fighter jet, remains a challenge. India does not yet have the domestic capability to produce the kind of high-performance engine that a fifth-generation fighter requires. And the United States, India's increasingly important defense partner, has been cautious about sharing the most sensitive propulsion technology. This is one of the key areas where the deepening U.S.-India defense industrial relationship will be tested. India wants more. The United States is considering how much to share. Both sides understand that the answer to that question will significantly shape the trajectory of one of the most important bilateral relationships in the world. Here is the question that sits at the heart of everything we have been talking about. Does India want to be a superpower? Not in the way the question is usually asked, as a measure of military might or economic size, but in the deeper sense, in the sense of wanting to dominate, wanting to dictate terms, wanting to build a world in India's image the way the United States built a world in America's image after World War II, or the way Britain built a world in its image during the centuries of empire. The answer, from everything we can observe about Indian foreign policy and Indian strategic culture, is no. Not because India lacks the ambition or the capability, but because India's civilizational outlook, shaped by thousands of years of history, by the philosophy of non-alignment that Jawaharlal Nehru elevated to a strategic doctrine, by the lived experience of being on the receiving end of colonial domination, sees hegemony as a trap rather than a prize. India wants parity. India wants respect. India wants its interests to be taken seriously in every room where global decisions are made. But India does not want to be the policeman of the world. It does not want to maintain 100 military bases in foreign countries. It does not want to use its economic weight to punish nations that do not follow its lead. When India held the G20 presidency in 2023 and chose as its theme the phrase "one world, one family," that was not marketing. That was a statement of philosophical orientation. India genuinely believes in a world where multiple powers coexist, where no single country calls all the shots, where smaller nations have agency and voice. That is not a naive belief. India is clear-eyed about the fact that in this multipolar world it is advocating for, there will still be competition, still be conflict, still be moments where red lines are crossed and India must push back firmly. Pakistan crosses those red lines regularly. China has crossed them too, on the border, in the Indian Ocean, in diplomatic forums. When sovereignty is threatened, India responds. When dignity is attacked, India defends it. But the baseline posture, the default setting, is partnership over domination, friendship over fear. And that in a world that is exhausted by the aggressive zero-sum games of the two current superpowers is extraordinarily appealing. Let us zoom out and see the full picture. All of these deals, Greece, the EU, the US, Canada, Oman, the Gulf states, they are not isolated bilateral transactions. They are pieces of a much larger puzzle. And when you put those pieces together, what you see is an emerging architecture of connectivity that could reshape global trade routes for decades. The India-Middle East-Europe corridor. This is India's answer to China's Belt and Road Initiative. While Belt and Road built a Chinese-centered web of infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Europe, ports, roads, railways, all connected back to Beijing, the IMEC envisions a different kind of network, one that links India's west coast through sea lanes to the Gulf states of Oman, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, from there, overland through the Arabian Peninsula and across the Middle East, and then through the Eastern Mediterranean to Greece, to Piraeus, and into the heart of Europe. A trade route that bypasses the Suez Canal. A supply chain that does not depend on the narrow choke points that make the current global trading system so vulnerable to disruption. An infrastructure network that is built on partnership rather than debt dependency. This is why Oman matters in India's diplomatic calendar. This is why the Gulf relationships matter. This is why Greece, despite being a relatively small country, is being treated as a strategic priority rather than a pleasant add-on. Every deal India is signing right now, when viewed through the lens of the IMEC, is a brick in a building that India is constructing over decades. The China comparison is worth dwelling on. Belt and Road was built quickly, with vast sums of money, generating headlines and grand ceremonies and signed agreements. But it also generated debt traps, political resentment, accusations of sovereignty, erosion in the countries that hosted its infrastructure. The port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka, the port of Piraeus in Greece, Zambia's national electricity company. Country after country finding that Chinese infrastructure investment came with strings attached, strings that over time pulled tight. India is building its corridor differently, more slowly, more carefully, with less money up front and more emphasis on genuine partnership, on co-investment, on arrangements where the host country retains real ownership and control. The pace is sometimes frustrating, the scale is sometimes smaller than the ambition requires, but the foundation is more solid, the relationships are more durable, and in the long game of infrastructure and trade, durability matters more than speed. 8 months, 15 major deals, partnerships across Europe, the US, and beyond. One country. This isn't luck. It's not the result of others' mistakes. It's the outcome of decades of patience, of a nation that held its ground, refused to be shaped by others, and played the long game. India didn't suddenly rise, it rebuilt, from colonization to confidence, from dependence to capability, from isolation to being the partner the world now seeks. When India is called an upcoming superpower, it's not a prediction. It's a recognition. India has arrived. The real question is whether the world is ready for what that means. Because a confident India reshapes the global order, making it more balanced, more multipolar, and less dependent on old power structures. And as country after country turns to New Delhi, one question lingers. What took the world so long? If this made you think, share it, and subscribe for more conversations like this.